Hi, I'm Dr. Renee Hackney, and welcome to part 3 in our series on managing tantrums. In part 1, we talked about a few basic things to know, kind of the age guidelines and the difference between expressing negative emotion versus a child having a tantrum. In part 2, we talked about the long-term ways to prevent tantrums. That's working on emotion language, that's working on ways to calm. Today we're going to talk about the short-term prevention, what to do when they're about to have a tantrum, kind of in those moments before. Now, what to do in those moments, one is looking at their triggers, and the other is looking at their cues. So let's start with triggers. Triggers are what sets your child off. And if you know what sets them off, you're a little more likely to be able to stay in front of that thing or help the child learn to manage that thing. So triggers fall into 3 categories. The first is the child tantrums over, that's called situational triggers. And that's they tantrum because they're hungry or they tantrum because they're tired. If that's your child, they tantrum because they're hungry or they're tired, that's actually on you. So if they're hungry, you need to carry crackers in your bag. You need to feed them more often. Maybe look at when in their 24-hour cycle are they getting enough protein to make it through the afternoon. And so that idea is just knowing if it's because they're hungry, they likely aren't feeding themselves very often through the day. And so it's on you to stay in front of that. If it's they're tantruming because they're tired often, you might look at sleep in the 24-hour cycle. You might look again at their nap schedule. You might take a class about children's sleep, or you might read some good books about children's sleep. But it's solving those things for kids because often they can't solve those things themselves. And those are called situational trigger. The second category is called a social trigger, and this is a little harder. A social trigger is they tantrum over being told no, or they tantrum over having to share toys, or they tantrum over people being too close. The idea is it's something that they're going to need to learn to manage in the long run. And so if your child, let's take that easier one, the child tantrums over having to share toys or having to take turns. The idea there is you have to teach them what to do and how to take turns and how to wait for a turn and how to ask for a turn. So you might read children's storybooks about turn taking and sharing. You might role play it with them. You might draw pictures of it going well before their next play date. You might give them a little pep talk before it happens. The idea is you're helping them learn to manage that. Now, I have had parents who say, no, we just avoid. For example, I had a mom of a 6-year-old who said he just melts down over winning and losing at games, so we're not playing any more games. It's probably not the answer. The child needs to learn how to win and lose at games in a better way and needs to learn how to manage that sense of competition. And so you coach it directly. You read storybooks like Winners Never Quit, and you play little games like tic-tac-toe often so you can practice being a gracious winner and being a good sport loser. It's coaching the wanted behaviors when it's the social triggers. The third set of triggers, and this is, again, a hard one, it's parent stress level. When parents are particularly stressed, you may have a child who tantrums more. Part of it is they may be just reflecting the level of emotion in the house. People are stressed out, there's a lot of negative emotions, and so they're giving some of that back. It may also be, though, that when you're stressed, you're not as in tune. So you're particularly stressed, you don't see them rubbing their eyes. They have to be dragging on the floor for you to recognize tired. Or you don't hear them whimpering a little. They have to be sobbing for you to recognize sad. If your child has to be dragging and sobbing for you to get it because you're stressed out and you're not as in tune, of course they're going to tantrum more. They're having to get bigger and louder to get your attention. And I'm not saying be a super parent, you're going to be stressed, but it's just recognizing that that can play a role in their tantrums. So with the triggers, if it's a situational or a social trigger, you address that thing. You figure that thing out or coach that thing for your children. If it's parent stress level, it's just taking a step back and figuring that out and hoping to lessen the level of stress in the house. That's triggers. Their cues are signs they're about to lose it. And so there are some kids who give you no cues. They are walking along and boom, they're on the floor. And I did not see that coming. But most kids give you a little warning. Cues for a tantrum might be their voice goes up a notch or two, or it might be they start to get really whiny, or it might be their eyes narrow and their shoulders rub out. They're giving you a signal with that voice, with that eyes narrowing, that the tantrum is about to happen. If you know your child and you're like, yeah, I can tell about 30 seconds before, they're giving you those cues. Now, if your child gives you cues that the tantrum is about to happen, use that. The folks who write about tantrums say it's good to jump in before the tantrum happens, and that would be jumping in first with empathy. So when you see the cue, try empathy for several tantrums in a row and see if that might derail the tantrum. Empathy is validating that emotion, acknowledging why they feel that way. I know you are frustrated. You didn't like that game. That was so hard. That's empathy. And when you give empathy, many children, it helps them calm down a bit. If not empathy, so let's say empathy is not working, positive intent is the good reason behind the behavior. So my younger daughter, she only tantrumed over not being able to do something like get puzzle pieces together or get a jar open. All she needed was a little, I know you're working hard. That's not really empathy. It's not her emotion. It's what she wanted or what she was doing. I know you really want that open. That's positive intent. And so it's seeing kind of good reason behind behavior. I'll give you another example of positive intent. Let's say you're making a fun snack upstairs and kids are waiting for fun snack downstairs and you yell down, "Snack's ready," and they're tearing past each other on the stairs. Somebody falls and gets hurt. Negative intent, you all are so careless, look, you hurt her. Positive intent, I know it is so hard to wait. That was a long time. You're not excusing away the behavior because you can then follow that up with consequences for pushing friend, but the idea of positive intent is seeing the good reason behind. So you try empathy when you see the cue for several tantrums. That's not working. You try positive intent for several times when you see the cue. If that's not working, another thing you might try if you see the cue and you know the tantrum is about to happen is to try choices. And this is where you say to the child, do you want to do that again or do you want me to try? Do you want to do that standing or sitting? This is just a distraction away from the tantrum. The idea is if the child stops and makes a choice, they're being a little more cognitive, which is often less emotional. So you might lessen that level of emotion by getting them to make a decision. If you can jump in before the tantrum starts with empathy, positive intent, choices, you might avoid the tantrum, and that's great in the moment. It's fine to do. All the while, you're still working on their triggers, the situational triggers, the social triggers, to lessen the tantrums that way as well. And you're working on emotion language, you're working on ways to calm. So you're doing all this background work to lessen the tantrum, and then you're also trying to avoid the tantrum in the moment. With triggers and cues, the idea is you might bypass some of those tantrums. In part 4, the next part of this series, I'm going to talk about what to do once the tantrum starts. As much as we're trying to avoid it, you still may end up with tantrums. So we're going to talk about having a plan. And then in part 5, we'll talk about the role of intermittency or why you want to have a really consistent response. Thank you so much for joining me.